Morning everyone. Okay, let's just check that all the stream is working well. So, it's been a while since I've done a stream. I think I missed August. And it's about 6 a.m. in the morning here, so I'm a bit sleepy. I thought, I'll set my alarm for about 5:30 and I'll wake up. So I wake up in the middle, wake up thinking, it must be about 5:30, my body clock's pretty good. No, it's 4:30. Oh. Okay, so it's not going to be such a great morning. Excellent. So to start with, thanks everyone for joining me for the live stream, and thanks everyone for being a supporter in the last, and sometimes now getting on to well over a couple of years now. It's been made a huge difference to my being able to make videos and review stuff in general. It made it possible to continue, otherwise I would have had to stop. So thanks again to everyone who's been a supporter. And for people who are new to watching me, who don't already know, my videos are primarily supported by people who pay, say, a couple of bucks a month, and they, in exchange, get my free advice anytime and go in the draw to win free stuff. See the videos in advance. I can see if I can remember all this stuff. And we have a private community where we just, chat and talk about gear and that kind of thing. So, to start with this morning, for my supporters, I have a number of questions, and I'll get through those first. I've got to see if I can read this name. Dystasia asks, I would like to know more about tube amplifier maintenance and care. I have a Lear 3 sent for repairs multiple times now, and I don't yet exactly know what's happening. Last time they said they had to repair the high voltage tube rails. This is my first tube amplifier, and I'd like to know general tips for maintaining my tube amplifier and tubes in good condition, such as on-time duration, off-time duration, cleaning, ambient temperature, moisture, etc. Things that are damaging to tubes and should be avoided. And should I have surge protection and maybe a UPS behind my tube amplifiers? Does it help trying to save the life of it? And what about impact of sound and protection devices? So, now there's a lot to get into. Usually, the main thing about tubes is that they don't last forever. They last about 10,000 hours. And then you start, depending on the tube, to start getting issues like maybe a channel starts dropping out, or the sound starts becoming a bit weak or strange or something like that. The main thing, the Lear 3 had an issue where it was the particular tube sockets, and some tubes, it was easy to insert the tubes the wrong way. I mean, you could insert them, but you'd have to use a little bit more force because it is say for example, this one that they include, an aftermarket 6SN7, the little notch, the guiding notch to show which way around it should be put in, is only kind of small. Some tubes it's got a fairly large notch, and this tongue sole reissue has a fairly small notch. So it was easy, like with the center hole was a little bit too large. It was easy to slide it in, and I actually ended up doing this once by accident and actually broke off the centerpiece. It's actually glued in place on this one. But that's the main thing, is to be very careful about putting the tube in correctly. There shouldn't be, I suppose, the rule is you don't overhandle them, like putting lots of fingerprints on them. I suppose you could even, like, just while the tube's cold, wipe off the fingerprints and stuff like that with a dry cloth. Moisture, of course, with any electronics should be avoided entirely. But yeah, if something's repeatedly dying, that's kind of odd. I would say that if you have, I've noticed two issues with people who have repeated problems with electronics. One is that they're cursed. I knew a guy who just about everything he touched just stopped working. I had friends who would tell stories about this. I don't remember which famous guy it was. Was it Edison or was it another guy? Who every time he walked into his lab, something broke. And it's just a weird electronic curse. And I've had customers like this too. Everything they touched, no matter how reliable it was from the factory, just broke. The second is power issues in the house. When I used to service Apple computers, I did software service rather than hardware service back when it was kind of more necessary in around 1999. Yeah, that sounds about right. I remember that we'd have a customer come in, they said, their computer's not working, and I plug it in and test it, worked perfectly. And it turned out there was a power issue in their house, or maybe their office. And another one we worked out was the second round of colored iMacs, when there was an issue where they were sensitive to power fluctuations or something like that. I'd guessed that before it actually became a firmware upgrade for them. So it turned out that's the other thing. I think the more than a UPS, it's interesting having a PS Audio Power Plant Premier here, and I was lucky to pick one up cheap. Is that the amount of distortion on the incoming signal is actually considerably higher than you might imagine. It's obviously the AC wave is not very clean, and I guess some gear is sensitive to it, or you may be having some kind of power surge protection might well be an idea. And who knows what's going on in the house. I was just the other day, I was sitting up here listening and hear this bzzz, and every minute for about 10 seconds this buzz would go on. I was like, what? And I traced it down to a transformer I had where is actually a transformer which I'd unscrewed and put on, rather than the cheap cable that was attached to it, put on a bit of wire. But it had a screw, and then it had one nut holding the transformer in, and then a second nut holding the back plate on. And the inner screws I hadn't tightened properly, because I'd unscrewed it thinking that would make it easy to get the nut off the back plate, but it had also unscrewed the inner screw and inner nuts, which kind of, and some component, something in my house when it was around dinner time, and my wife was cooking, and I don't know what was going on, but someone, maybe it could have been a washing machine, I don't know if it could have been a washing machine, some piece of electronics in my house was sending, even through the Power Plant Premier, there's some surge going on, and the Power Plant Premier's input distortion level jumped for 10 seconds every minute, and it was causing this transformer to vibrate. And even after I tightened that up and unplugged it, even the transformers inside my disc arrays were vibrating too. And it's like, what? So there's weird stuff can go on the power in your house. The reliability can be, I don't know what, it could even begin to know what could be caused. I've had people who had, was it LED lights or something like that? Sometimes if you have a light that's got an issue, it can cause buzzing through your radios and stuff like that. And we had that. We got one of those new low power lights when they were all the rage back in the 90s, I think. And we had a buzzing in the radio all the time. And we eventually had people come round and with meters and everything like that. It turned out to be one of these lights. The electronics in it were causing buzzing. So I don't know if the amplifier is going back. If you have gear that's repeatedly breaking, I would be checking my power supply to my house or whatever it is to see if something is an issue. So ranting on about power. But the cheap way around that, some people get trip light isolation transformers is one supposedly cheap and effective way of improving the power supply to your gear. But yeah, I haven't played with a lot of this stuff. I wouldn't mind doing so, but it's just the weight and effort required to do this, and yeah, I don't know anyone with it, so that I could borrow it. But you can actually get trip light transformers here, but they're third-party imported, and the price difference between what you actually pay for them in the US and here is just massive. Other than that, usage time for a tube amp is, well, of course, the tubes only last about 10,000 hours, so the more you have them sitting on, the more you're using up the tube life. And the problem with the Studio 6 is it sounds best after it's warmed up. For me, I reckon it sounds best at the end of the day after it's been on for about 8 hours. And that's probably because of the large transformers. There's nothing to do with the tubes, I think. Tubes should heat up within, a couple of minutes. But the transformers in there are huge, so once it warms up at the end of the day, it's really, really nice. But that means I'm wasting tube life having it sit there idle. Yeah, so it's with something like a Lear 3, it should get to warm. I think it's more like high-end gear, which I consider long on time, like these things with big transformers and a lot of electronics. Everything else, try not to knock stuff over here. Everything else is. I wouldn't. If there's smaller stuff, like a few minutes to warm up, less than an hour. Bifrost 2, well, it's a tricky one because it has those funny ladder decks in them. But unless you've got really big gear, as I said, like these two things behind me, then the warm-up time shouldn't be, more than an hour at most. I reckon anyway. Okay, next question was from Sherry. How large of an impact would there be if a component of your system, for example a DAC amp or RCA XLR splitter, unusual one, is powered from a household step-up, step-down transformer? Well, that's a good question. How much of a difference? I think it's going to, again, it depends on the power in your house. If you have a really good power supply, then maybe you don't have a lot of stuff interfering with the power like other electronics, then it should be maybe less of a difference. Or if there's a lot of electronics, or maybe you're in a, I don't know how much apartment buildings affect it. Like if you're in an apartment in the middle of a city, maybe it would make more of a difference, possibly. One thing you can try is, let's say you have your system plugged into, plug your system into a separate power point where nothing else is plugged in. Now, supposedly, here's the thing about power cables, and power cable evil discussion here. Apparently, if you have, why would an audiophile power cable, even though it's only like 1.5 meters or 5, 6 feet, make a difference when it's only like the last bit of wire? You've got all this household wire and other wire going to the main power supply, from the city or whatever. Why would it make a difference? And apparently, like if you have if it's a well, constructed and shielded cable, apparently high frequency noise only travels. It acts as a high frequency noise filter, supposedly, and so that's why. Then I don't know how high frequency noise totally interacts with electronic gear, but having the high frequency noise, like the power cable acting as a high frequency noise filter, may or may not improve the sound quality of the system, which is like the first time I tried, a basically decent braided power cable. Was like, this shouldn't make any difference, but it did. That's odd. And apparently that's the reason that they work. So I would say how much of a difference it's going to make depends on, I would experiment with like cheaper options first, and then if you think, oh well, this is making a difference, then maybe get something dedicated, like some kind of dedicated power supply or isolation transformer or something for your whole system, because that's going to be cheaper in the long run. But the basic thing to do is like use a different power point in your house away from other electronics, so that any noise other electronics are generating is less likely to be picked up by a power socket further away, I guess is how it works. Simple stuff, maybe, see, does a basic power cord seem to make a difference? Does an isolation transformer make a difference? And those are the cheaper options, and I think better value options. I mean, if you depend, it's relative to what you're using, I suppose. Like, let's say you have a small shit audio system. Well, you wouldn't want to spend money on power supply stuff for that. If you're up to, expensive stuff like this, well, this has primarily the difference between this and the smaller audio GD gear is the power supply. And that's, they make even regenerated power supply versions of their equipment, which supposedly sound the best. And considerably, Kingware reckons the HE versions are like twice as good as the non-HE versions, apparently. Although I wouldn't want the power bill for them. Here the power's really expensive. And again, they use just oversized transformers in the Studio 6. So apparently power does make a primary difference, but this is one of those things that really needs someone to do a comprehensive kind of survey using, we made these changes to my system, I felt it made this improvement, and then let's measure the differences between the power AC waves or the DC and noise from up to high, inaudible high frequencies and everything. And the environment, noise in the environment. It would be interesting to do if someone actually went to the trouble of doing a comprehensive survey of the electronic environment and how much power stuff made a difference. But everyone goes, oh, I bought this and it made a difference. But that's kind of how the situation is at the moment. Yethal asks, what are new tubes? How do they differ from regular tubes, and why aren't they more widespread? So new tube is this thing from Korg, which is based on they basically are using tube technology, but they were used for like it's the tech used for vacuum display tubes, but they're very low power. They'll power off a battery. I mean, you can make a portable amp with them. They're that low power, but they're more or less a single-ended triode. Why aren't they more widespread? I was discussing this with someone. Why didn't they try using new tubes in their amp? And I can't remember exactly what they said. They have their own good and bad points. I mean, if you want, I suppose the main reason is you can't easily replace them. Although I suppose you could make a socket where you can pop them in and out. I guess they just haven't caught on in a big way. You know, some people, there are DIY kits with them. Some people use them in their amps. They had a nice amp here I did review from Apex, the Apex Sangaku. And I was like looking at that and I thought, oh, that's a really nice amp. And I was trying to get it back from the friend who's currently got it to use it as part of a review. And I just went to the Apex site and it's gone. So their cheaper amps unfortunately have gone. But it was apart from the fact that it if you even touched it and you'd hear it ringing in your ears, the tube wasn't well damped. I don't know why they aren't used, and I suppose there would be a good alternative for amps, especially portable amps, or now we have of course Cayenne's N8 which has one, where instead of using those hearing aid tubes which are their new old stock, you can use a brand new Korg new tube, although it's a little bit bigger, and probably get the same effect without having to use any more power. And they're readily available. Although I don't know what the shelf life is of them. I have to check. I think it's I guess it might be longer than a normal tube. So I don't know why they're not more popular. I guess regular tubes there are still very abundant. You know, there you can buy. There are new versions of, you know, the new Electro Harmonics has brand new tubes available. So I think it's just maybe easier to use those than. I mean, when people want tubes, they want something that, you know, a little pretty glowing tube kind of thing. So easier to use those, I guess. But there are some. The last manufacturer I asked about it had some. There are some particular electrical considerations which they didn't want to deal with, and that's, yeah. I would have to go back and find out what they said. Albert C asks, I've been playing around with speaker positions in a room lately. Noticed that pulling the speakers away from the back wall creates a soundstage. What is contributing to this effect? Is it reflection off the back wall? Yes. There's a site on this which explains it. So if you have a speaker and a back wall and there's different ratios, you can test this by moving yourself. There's a site, and I have to find the link. So let's say my speakers are backported so that some of the bass energy goes to the back wall and is reflected and bounces off and goes forward. And then from the speaker, you of course have the front cones and front drivers which project sound forward. And some, you know, the interference of this and the distance you are affects how your perception of how the kind of the sound stage and the amount of bass. And, you know, for example, if I play music now where I'm sitting in my desk, I don't hear a great deal of bass, but if I go right up to the speakers, I can hear huge amounts of bass bouncing off the back wall. So it's this kind of relationship of front and back wall, position and back wall and how it's connected. And I read this and I was experimenting around as well. And I actually, it was interesting. I have a corner with a little window and next to a cupboard. And so it's got a gap that if you can find these gap shells in Japan, which are like super narrow. And I actually searched around for about an hour searching for the right size of gap shelf, which would fit in this gap to make a bass trap. And I put some boxes on there, and it's a perfect bass trap. And the bass traps here cost, you know, a few $100s, so it was, you know, $80 or whatever. But there's a site on it, and I wish I had the link handy, but I don't. Someone will probably post it. So, yeah, I'm not a big expert on speakers. I never spent many years without them, so. But a lot of all the information now is all available online. But I suppose you just have to experiment, and there are various ratios which work, and then different speakers have, you know, my speakers are LACs, which are bottom ported as well, and I chose those deliberately to avoid having to deal with the bass issues, although there were some, obviously. But it's much easier to not have to deal with it than to kind of have to, you get some speakers which everyone says are great, then they don't suit your room. Albert also asks, what are the best record labels, recording engineers, studios in terms of sound quality from your memory? I haven't looked into this a lot. My two favorites are the two that I know, or three that I know, are David Chesky as binaural recordings. The second is some Decca Masters. I don't know if all or some or most. The third, of course, is stuff like native DSD, where they go out of their way to record stuff to the highest quality possible with minimum mastering. Recording, this is important because I'll eventually, when I get it together, do an MQA video. And the thing is, you know, people, they record, recordings are done in, well, you know, you have a studio, and like say someone sings, you have a singer, for example, or a band, and then they record that onto a track. Depending on the music, they might, modern pop stuff, you know, you have the singer in a box, in the phone box, you probably can see this online, and then they just, they already recorded the music, and they just sing to the music. And they, the worst of it, they run it through a processor where the person doesn't have to even be in tune, it just auto-tunes it. They just have to, the singer just has to show up, they can sound like total crap, and the software fixes it. Or modern stuff where they deliberately distort the voice to make it sound robotic because it's a cool thing to do. The worst, some god-awful pop that came on randomly on Tidal at one stage. Yeah. Why do they deliberately distort voices? I want to hear what the singer's singing, not just, you know, it's weird. I don't know. It's like people don't want to hear the singer. They want to hear a distorted version of the singer. I don't know. But, you know, the purest stuff would be like, I suppose David Chesky would... He places, if not just a dummy head, he would use, as far as I've seen, uses a dummy head, and maybe the singer has a microphone, and then he will do some balancing of, you know, mixing and balancing of that. And he just has a new album coming that is out, which if you go into Headfire, there's a discount code for, which is 3, I forgot what it's called. It's got a 3 in there, and they did the same recording of a bunch of jazz musicians, and they did it with 3 mics. So they did it with a stereo, a mic, a stereo pair, and a stereo mic. And there's 3 versions: one with just the stereo ribbon mic, one with a omni pair, and then one with both. And you get to hear the difference between how the sound stage is with all 3. It's really interesting hearing it on headphones and speakers separately. But the thing is, between that, then you have mastering, and the sound could be passed through, God only knows what electronics. It could be just purely digital. They could pass it through various, you know, the old school way was to pass it through various electronics that had various effects, ranging from, you know, they might pass it through a tube, gear with a lot of tubes to make it sound mellow. They might pass it through compressors, which is the most common one. Who knows what they do to it? So all this, you know, going back to what the artist intended, is mostly a load of BS, unless it's the artist is someone like Patricia Barber, who does a lot of stuff. I think does a lot of has very detailed control over what she does, over the process, but you know, the big artists and the big companies, they don't have any control over what happens. And the fun thing that came out was with MQAs, you know, claim that they go back to the original recording is absolute crap, because the mastering engineers have come out and said, we never got consulted on this. They haven't even come and found or used the original recordings. It's absolute bullcrap. But that's for another video. So what's the best stuff? There's probably other stuff out there which is the best. I don't have a list, unfortunately. I should. So it's a good question. But, you know, beware that when stuff is being recorded, between the recording and what you hear, the mastering, there could be a lot of stuff in between there, and you do lose a lot from that.